And welcome to At Issue. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm H. Wayne Wilson, and it's October. That means it's time to talk politics. We have an election coming up the first Tuesday in November, and we're going to be talking about the 92nd House District. And the 92nd House District spans roughly from Glen Avenue in Peoria down to the southern tip of Peoria County along the Illinois River. And with that, let me introduce the challenger. Jim Montalongo is the challenger. He's a Republican, and he is finishing his, well, he's in his first term on the Peoria City Council. Thank you for joining us, Jim.
Thank you for having me here.
And the incumbent is a Democrat, Jahan Gordon. Thank you so much. You're finishing your first term shortly in the legislature. And with that, I don't think this is going to be any surprise. But before I start, I should point out, just to be on the safe side, I live in the 92nd District, just for full disclosure. The budget for the state of Illinois.
Yes.
You have been quoted as saying that you don't want an income tax increase, and you're calling for more money for educational funding. How on earth are you going to balance the Illinois budget? Because technically, the state constitution requires a balanced budget.
When I asked for funding for the schools, when I would advocate for education funding, I advocated for what was called the foundational level to be funded. The foundational level funding is an appropriation that is that appropriation is decided by an independent entity, and they come up with this foundational funding level to indicate that in order for the state of Illinois to be at a decent pace in terms of educating their young people, they should be appropriating $6,543 for each student in the state of Illinois if the property valuation isn't higher because of the way that Illinois funds its schools. Because some schools don't get any of that foundational level funding dollars because their property valuation is so much higher that the property values that are levied go to that school. Oftentimes, rural schools and urban schools don't have the ability to compete because oftentimes the amount of money that each school gets is determined by the zip code that they live in. So I have been a proponent and an advocate for education funding, and I always will be. In terms of what I've really called for with education is, yes, do I think there should be more money in education? Absolutely, because that is our future. But I've also called for some very specific and decisive education reforms. I've been working with a group called Stand for Children, and it's a group that has gone to organize in some states, in some state legislatures across the country. All of the states that have received the competitive Race for the Top funding were all states that Stand for Children. The group Stand for Children has come in to organize. Obviously, reform is something that's very difficult for people to grasp, particularly at the state level when you have so many competing interests between the unions, some of the groups that are already involved with the education conversation. But this group is a group that in some places there was some resistance when they came into the state, but this group has decided to work with me because they have seen my voting record. They see that I have been a very fair, and a very balanced state representative. They indicated to me that they had been watching me. They saw my voting record. They saw that I was willing to challenge status quo when it was necessary. I was willing to make the hard votes, even when it was a difficult thing to do. As a freshman, I was willing to take on those issues. So again, I think that when looking specifically at education, yes, we do need additional funding, but we have to do the reforms first. I do think that we have to continue to fund education so that we don't lose ground, but we cannot continue to dump money into a system that obviously is antiquated.
Jim, you also have said no to an income tax increase, and yet you call for a balanced budget, and you say, let's stop borrowing from the 5 pension funds. The question to you is the same. How are you going to balance the budget?
Well, first of all, I've served on a Peoria City Council that has balanced its budget for the last 3 years without raising taxes. And I'm proud to say that I learned a process that has to happen in order to get to a balanced budget. And I might also add that we've made all our pension payment obligations as well. In fact, we're probably one of the best cities in Illinois. So that's the background that I have in learning about balancing a budget. We need a roadmap is what we are in need of to balance our budget. I like what the Illinois Policy Institute says to balance the budget, and they give us a roadmap. So your revenues are in about $27 billion. They say to roll back the appropriations for each department like it was the year 2008, 2009. And then from there, we got to eliminate some of the waste that we have, I should say a lot of waste that we have in our government today, and stop some of the wasteful spending. And we could pick things like the fleet, the air fleet that we have that fly around our high-powered politicians, and that would be an example of waste that we need to. But on day one, what I would like to do as a show of leadership is that I would take a 10% cut, maybe more, but just to show that we're serious about it and it needs to start at the top. There is a Sunshine Committee.
For clarification, a 10% cut in
my pay.
Your pay. Okay,
yes.
Go ahead. I'm sorry for interrupting.
I would like to activate what is called the Sunshine Committee, which is made up of legislators and business people that will look at cutting waste, look at streamlining our government, and I think we need to be listening to those recommendations coming from those folks as well. So that's for starters on how we start getting to a balanced budget. There is a roadmap there, and maybe not dollar per dollar, but that's where we start. It also gives room to start paying into our pension systems, which is something that we have to. We have to start paying our bills.
Jahan, you focus primarily on education. How about some specifics on what something has to be cut? If we're not going to raise the income tax,
agree.
First of all, can you balance the budget without raising the income tax, without damaging the pension funds, futures, et cetera?
Certainly. One of the things that I've been discussing throughout this entire process, that my opponent and I have been out on the campaign trail, and some of the things that I've discussed with some of my colleagues, is that what we need to begin to do is, my very first, before I was even installed in the legislature, at a freshman legislator conference to kind of talk about some of the things that were going to be going on in that upcoming year, because we are in the worst economic down period that we've had since the Great Depression. I indicated at that time that we needed an Illinois Blueprint 2020. And I do believe that as we began to walk into the legislature January of 2009, people did not realize how bad things truly were. So at that time, obviously there was a lot of focus on impeaching the former governor. And then we went into a full-on budget crisis. Because that hadn't happened in anyone's tenure, I think to truly understand that process, you'd almost have to be there and see it. Because oftentimes we look at individual programs, but when you are a legislator, you have to be concerned about every program, every line item, every expenditure, every resource that comes into the state. So having had the opportunity to look at not maybe a couple $1 million deficit, but a couple billion, right now we're facing something around a $14 billion structural deficit. So the only way that I see in getting out of this mess is, again, what I've continued to talk about the entire time on the campaign trail, and that is coming up with an Illinois Blueprint 2020 and identifying what are our goals, what are our priorities, to ensure that the money follows those priorities. If we indicate that, say, K through 12 education is the primary objective and the primary goal for the state of Illinois, then we need to ensure that our expenditures are going to meet the resources that we bring in. And we do that through a zero-based performance budgeting system, where we go through each year and start every contract, every department at zero. The common practice has been for the state of Illinois for so many years is to tack on an additional 3% onto whatever they received the previous year. So because it took almost my entire lifetime to get into the mess that we're in, I mean, these problems have been in existence for about 30 years now. So we're not going to get out of this mess in 1 year. We didn't get in here in 1 year, we won't get out in 1 year. But I do believe that there has to be some very, very difficult decisions that are going to have to be made. And I think that with an Illinois Blueprint for 2020, where we'd like to be in terms of some of the goals and some of the performance-based measures that we will assure that each year, each person who's contracting with the state, they will meet those specific goals, and we'll do that through a zero performance-based budgeting system, so that there are no longer the inflated numbers that oftentimes happen within a budget cycle. Any additional money that may come in, because I would like to see us using some very less than optimistic numbers, so that we're very clear and very concise on what it is that we bring in, and then continue to pay the budget down. The pension payments, the pension system had not been paid into the way that it should have been, going back to the days of Governor Thompson. That was the reason why during 1995, during the Edgar administration, the current system that we're in right now, where we have this ramp-up pension payment, the reason why we're in that ramp-up right now was because in 1995, legislation was passed in order to have the Illinois pension system funded by 80% by 2045. So coming into this system, I do feel that there are some changes that need to be made from the bottom up in terms of the entire budgeting system. But I don't think, specifically speaking to taxes, that would be that's not the first place that we start when looking at the problems that we face in terms of our budget. We have to look to reform the way that we do our budgeting system, and show citizens and create a truly transparent process where folks know that the dollars that we spend are specifically going to the areas that we have indicated as an entire body, not just a legislative body, but constituents, the business community, and legislators are all coming together and say, these are our priorities and these are where we're spending our dollars. So if constituents say, you know what, we think that this over here, whatever that may be, this is a priority, this is something that we want to see happen, then the constituents have the opportunity to say, you know what, I want my taxes raised in order to have this. And without that happening, I don't think that the business community that provides the jobs, that employ the folks who pay the income taxes, who pay the sales taxes because they have the additional revenue to go out and spend, without a comprehensive plan such as that one, I think that a tax increase at this time would be counterproductive to where we are right now.
And an opportunity to Jim to address the same issue. Is it possible to balance the budget?
It is possible to balance the budget, and we can do it. It's going to definitely, some tough decisions will have to be made. We've had to make those tough decisions on the Peoria City Council year after year with tough economic times. But the one thing I think is important to point out, if you take a look at like Indiana, they have $1 billion surplus. And those things just don't happen overnight. It takes fiscal responsibility to happen. Our state right now, we have an $80 billion unfunded pension liability. We have a $13 billion deficit. In just the last 2 years, my opponent voted for $5 billion of that, overspending our budget. And we're not going to solve the problem by overspending the budget. And just to bring it back to another point, with the education, and absolutely education is important, but I think once again we have to look at what we can do to consolidate more of probably our administrative costs in our education instead of wanting to raise taxes. There's a bill, SB 750 out there, which my opponent is for, which basically it discusses all the education that she's mentioned here that she's for, but inside that also is a tax increase for the people from a 3 to 5%. And that's not the right direction that we need to be going.
A quick response from you,
Yes.
John?
House Bill 750 was a piece of legislation that existed before my tenure in the legislature. So when my opponent indicates that I supported a bill, how could I support a bill that did not even exist before I was in the legislature? House Bill 750 was in the 95th General Assembly. I served only in the 96th General Assembly. And to the comment about me voting to overspend by $5 billion, since I've been in the legislature, I have voted to cut the budget by over $4 billion in my tenure in the legislature.
That was an expense cutting, but when it comes back to the budget, just last May, House Bill 859, Senate Bill 1215 is where the overspend happens. I'm not talking about expense cutting, I'm talking about the actual budget.
And I'm speaking of the actual budget too, because if you talk to any contractor, anyone who does business with the state of Illinois, no one will indicate to you that they're receiving more money now than they were receiving in 2008 or in 2009. So if that's the case, then how could I be overspending if people are receiving less now than they did 2 years ago?
If you don't understand how budgeting works, you have amount of revenues that come in, and your expenses have to meet what your revenues are. That's called a balanced budget. So that's how it works. You're talking about actual spending on cash flow type issues when we're talking about the actual budget. That's the difference.
I'm very clear on how to balance a budget. And that's why in my tenure in the General Assembly,
Are you saying that the state has balanced its budget?
I have had the ability to work throughout this process and to find a way to ensure that we take care of the responsibilities. The state has a responsibility to educate the young people that live in this community that don't have the opportunity to go to a well-funded private school. The state has to ensure that the physically disabled, the mentally disabled, we have to ensure that they're cared for. The state has to ensure that seniors, that for all that they have done for our community, all that they have given, have the ability to live their golden years with decency and integrity. And that's what I've done since I've been in the state legislature.
A final remark regarding this topic, and we'll move on to the next topic.
Sure. It's about balancing your budget and priorities. If you overspend, because the number of nonprofits that I visited, Children's Home, for example, the amount of money that we owe these nonprofits, these services that are helping people, is in the millions of dollars that we have not paid them. What happens to them? They have to lay off people. Some of them go bankrupt, and people are not getting the services they need because we don't have a balanced budget.
I would hope that if Mr. Montalongo ever had the opportunity to serve, that he would not balance the budget on the backs of the people of the state of Illinois the way that he balanced the budget on the backs of the citizens living in the city of Peoria, cutting police at a time when we're going into one of the worst economic downturns, and not even 6 months later we see the murder rate go up almost 30%. At a time when we had never experienced this sort of crime. My opponent voted to cut police officers.
We made tough decisions with our budget, and it was done by a whole city council made up of both Republican and Democrats. And we came up with a balanced budget. We met with our employees, we met with our department heads. We got a recommendation from our police chief if we could still do the police duties that their responsibilities are for. And yes, we did it as a city council. We are responsible, and that's how we did it as a group. Balanced budget.
My opponent voted to cut 4 police officers, and in that same evening, he also voted to restoring the positions of a legal administrative at $53,000 a year, a network specialist at $55,000 a year, a telecommunicator at $56,000 per year. I'd like to ask my opponent, did he think that that was a better spend of the city tax dollars than to reinstating the jobs of those police officers who he laid off?
A final remark on this topic.
Sure. As far as those specific ones go, our city doesn't function if we don't have those positions. It was a recommendation by our city manager as well that we need those positions back in there. Otherwise, it's dysfunction. We are running on a very, very core group of people that keep our city running because of the past budgets and responsibilities that we have made as a city council, which the state has not been able to do, except they're going in the other direction, overspending, 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 and that's the part that you've been part of.
So what do you tell the families of those murdered young men and women because of the lack of the police presence within those communities? What do you tell those families?
Did you want to go on with this?
Jim, 30 seconds, and that's it. We're going to
Certainly.
move to jobs. We have to move to jobs quickly.
Well, first of all, I don't think it's because of the lack of police that we have on the force here that caused those murders. And that's probably the simple thing. It was more of a gang thing that was going on, and I'm sure you're aware of what was going on. You're trying to turn it into a city council issue when we're talking about the state and the overspend here. So that's what's gone on. It wasn't our police department killing the people, and it's not because they weren't doing their job.
And with that, your yard signs say gyms for jobs.
Yes.
Montelongo for the state legislature. Specifically, we're going to run out of time if we
Sure.
don't get to the specifics. How, as a legislator, will you help to create jobs in Illinois?
Absolutely. You know, one of the most important things we have to do is we have to signal to the industry that Illinois is responsible with its finances and that we can balance our budget. And we also have to pay our bills. How can we be a business-friendly state when we can't pay our bills on time? So first and foremost, we have to balance that budget. We need to signal to the market. Second, I would like to activate a committee that will go in and look for over the past 20 years of the regulations that we have passed that have been against business and being able to grow businesses in Illinois. In fact, we chased out the trucking industry out of Illinois because of regulations and fees on them. So we lost them to Iowa and to Indiana. So there's two good examples on what we can do. Also, I think what's important is to help our small businesses grow. And I think we need to make sure that they are getting the capital that they need. The credit-worthy companies are getting the loans and access to capital that they need. So those are probably three specific things that we need to work on and to get jobs back growing. I might add that I'm a small business owner, and I have been for the last 20 years growing jobs, so I know what we need to do at small business. I'm also endorsed by the National Federation of Independent Business, that they said that I understand what the needs are for our small businesses and understand what it takes to grow jobs in our community.
The same question to you,
Certainly.
specifics on creating jobs.
Certainly. Well, let me give you a little bit of history about the things that I've done to actually create jobs and to retain jobs here in the state of Illinois since I've been in the Illinois General Assembly. I've had the ability to, number one, work to preserve a manufacturer's purchase tax credit and a research and development tax credit that went back into the budget for FY10. Last year, Governor Quinn discussed that he was going to cut both of those line items, which are incredibly important, not only to the 92nd District, but to the entire region in the state. Caterpillar, Komatsu, very large manufacturers depend on that tax credit. That tax credit, Caterpillar alone, saved $92 million. Obviously, we know what was happening last year when I entered the General Assembly. Unemployment was on the rise because of the downturn in the economy. Caterpillar directly indicated to me that the ability to save that $92 million was a saving so that they could ensure that they could continue to do the things as they were doing, and they would not have to slice jobs in order to maintain and preserve their stockholder rating. Number two, I worked to help pass a small business tax credit. I worked in an independent fashion and in a bipartisan way with all of our local legislators to ensure that Keystone Steel, one of the oldest steel companies in the United States, had the ability to save and preserve over 400 jobs. We worked on that piece of legislation at the beginning of this year. Those are some of the few things that I've done. Some of the things that I'd like to do is I would like to work in, if I'm blessed enough to win this election and go into the General Assembly in January of 2011, I'd like to work on making the research development tax credit permanent so that companies like Caterpillar and Komatsu can continue to make the long-term investments into the new jobs of the future so that we have the ability to have those jobs right here in Central Illinois. I've had many conversations with Caterpillar, and they've indicated that that would be extremely beneficial. I would like to add one last thing. There's a reason why groups like the UAW and Caterpillar Corporate have endorsed my candidacy. They typically don't always agree, but they've agreed that I'm the one for the job. There is a reason why the AFL-CIO, which is typically dominated by unions and people who vote Democratic, and the Peoria Chamber Political Action, the Peoria Chamber Political Action Committee have endorsed me, even though my opponent used to be the president of that organization. They've supported me because I'm the jobs candidate.
And at that point, I promised you both time for closing statements, 30 seconds each.
Yes.
The incumbent will go first.
I have worked in a bipartisan, independent fashion since my tenure in the Illinois General Assembly. I'm being supported by Democrats, by Republicans, by independents, by men, women, old and young, because I have showed and I have a proven track record that I am going to Springfield to do the job. I have a care, concern, and compassion for people, and I do believe that people have had the opportunity to understand that that's why I'm doing this. I don't do this because I have an ego or a chip on my shoulder, and I have been able to bring in many groups that don't often get along because they feel that I am someone who is positioned to get the job done for the people of the 92nd District.
And Jim.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me here today. In closing, I've had the opportunity over the last 6 months going door to door and hear the frustrations and the anger of the people of our state not balancing its budget and the wasteful spending that it has done. And most concerning as well is the number of people that are out of work who need a job. I have a track record of balancing a budget on a Peoria City Council without raising taxes. I have a track record of creating jobs in this community for the last 20 years and being a small business person. These are the two items that I will focus on and will deliver to this community.
And with that, we are out of time. Thank you to both the challenger, Republican Jim Montalongo, the incumbent Democrat Jahan Gordon,
Thank you.
for the spirited discussion.
Yes.
I appreciate it.
Thank
It was
you.
fun. And next week, we'll be talking to Thomas Kilbride, who is running for the 3rd District Supreme Court as a retention. That's a retention vote. We'll be visiting with Justice Kilbride next week here on At Issue.